Hello there, this is part 5 of my pre-HD Skyward Sword deep dive series. If you'd like to see the other parts, there will be a link to the full playlist in the description. In the previous part I talked about the overworld design, the sky, and Skyloft, so I'd recommend watching that first. Enjoy! Throughout the first act of Skyward Sword, you're forced to return to Skyloft to unlock each new region. And I actually think that this is sort of fine. Even though the flying is really tedious, it's kept to a somewhat manageable level since you only need to fly between extensive overworld visits. The distance from Skyloft to each region is also the shortest in the sky at around 20 seconds each. You're also traveling through the sky with a sense of purpose, since each flight promises either a beneficial return trip to Skyloft with helpful new goods and villager side quests, or a significant new gameplay experience in a brand new region. The first time through each region is also pretty decent, since you have a specific goal and there's a clear progression through the overworld, which gives you an overall sense of forward momentum. Even though what you're doing isn't always particularly good, especially in Faron and Eldin, the first act of the game overall has a fairly steady pace, and the core gameplay does get better with each region that you visit. However, as soon as you complete the first act, the pace immediately grinds to a screeching halt, and the rest of the game is stuffed to the gills with constant backtracking and filler content going forward. And I do mean as soon as you complete the first act. Right after you clear the dungeon in Lanayru, you're immediately bombarded with a lengthy sequence that honestly rivals the trading sequences that appear in other Zelda games. Let's give it a quick breakdown on fast forward here. You have to fly back to Faron to learn how to play the harp from the old woman in the sealed temple, and then she tells you to fly back to Skyloft to talk to the headmaster to learn the lyrics of the Ballad of the Goddess, and it turns out that there are instructions to rotate the two windmills in Skyloft to face the light tower and the plaza by blowing on the propellers on their base with the gust bellows. But one of the propellers fell to the surface, so you have to go talk to the owner of the scrap shop who has a flying robot named Scrapper who can carry it back up for you, but Scrapper needs to be repaired with an ancient flower. If you don't already have one, you have to fly all the way to Lanayru, get an ancient flower, then fly all the way back to Skyloft, then repair Scrapper, then fly all the way to Eldin to find a propeller by using dowsing, have Scrapper pick it up, then fly back to Skyloft to bring the propeller to the windmill to repair it, then finally rotate the windmill to face the light tower, which activates a platform on the top of it, so you climb to the top and play your harp on the platform to activate a beam of light that you have to follow across the entire sky to discover the Isle of Songs, where you have to solve an extremely long and tedious platform rotating puzzle to access the main entrance, and then you enter to get an expositional cutscene that explains that you have to go all the way back to Faron to play the harp to access a trial. So after all of this running back and forth all over the game world, you have to fly across the entire sky back to Faron and play the harp a short distance from where you learned how to play it in the first place. This entire segment, not even counting the boss fight against the imprisoned right before it, takes half an hour, and counting the boss fight plus all of the dialogue and cutscenes associated with it can take upwards of a full hour just to proceed to the next part of the game. For comparison's sake, the Begoran sword trading sequence in Ocarina of Time also takes around half an hour to complete, but not only is this trading sequence both more entertaining to do and entirely optional, but you can also drop it at any time and pick it back up later, and you're doing it for the sake of getting a major gameplay reward. You have to do this entire sequence in Skyward Sword before you're allowed to continue playing the game, and there's no reward for doing any of this, so it's nothing but dreadful filler. Deep breaths. It might sound like this is just one particularly bad segment, and that is true, but the entire rest of the game is plagued by nonsensical progression like this. There is so much pointless backtracking and running back and forth. Before unlocking the next dungeon in each region, you have to backtrack through each overworld area while dowsing to find a special trial gate, and then in both Faron and Eldin, you have to backtrack through the overworld again after this. In Faron, you're given a dowsing target that's at the opposite end of the map from where you are, but you can't tell that while dowsing, you can only tell which direction it's in. It's located all the way back in the first dungeon, which you have to backtrack through the entire forest to reach, and then traverse through a second time. Almost nothing has changed in the overworld or the dungeon from the first visit, other than some enemies being a bit tougher and a couple of the rooms being flooded. The only worthwhile reason for this segment to exist is to re-explore the first dungeon with your new swimming abilities, but this takes place right after a lengthy swimming tutorial, and the swimming here takes less than 10 seconds. It would have been really cool if the entire dungeon was flooded and this was the swimming tutorial, but as is, there's no reason for this other than as padding to the game's runtime. Eldin is even worse, because not only are you forced to climb from the bottom of the volcano to the top along the same identical path again, but you're stuck in an escort mission with Scrapper. There are far more enemies this time around, and Scrapper blares alarms and yells at you every time an enemy is nearby. He's also carrying a giant water basin, which means he takes up a huge amount of space, and he always shoves himself right up behind you, which not only can make it hard to see what you're doing, but also means enemies have a very easy time of hitting him, and Scrapper can only take a few hits before you're forced to restart from the beginning. You can ride the wind tunnel shortcut to the top of the volcano and leave Scrapper behind, but then you need to climb all the way down the volcano fighting enemies along the way, and then climb all the way back up again with no obstacles, which is just mind-numbing. This segment takes place right after getting the bow, and there are arrow drops everywhere, so you're encouraged to snipe enemies from afar along the way up, but because there are so many enemies, it drags the pace down to a crawl. And if at any point during this segment you try to move quickly to get through it faster, Scrapper complains about how fast you're going, so you're chastised for being efficient. This entire escort mission is incredibly aggravating and just more pointless padding. There are bird statues peppered across the overworld that you can warp to, but you can't use the bird statues to skip necessary backtracking segments, like retreading Elden Volcano again. You can use them to skip the backtracking in Faron Woods if you know to return to the first dungeon, but there's no way to quick warp between bird statues. You either need to backtrack through the entire overworld, or you need to find a bird statue, fly into the sky, turn around and fly back down through the clouds, and then pick where you want to descend, which takes almost a full minute, and you still have to backtrack through the dungeon itself. It's technically faster, but it's not a viable solution here. Being able to pick a warp point in the overworld is useful, since the overworld exploration itself is so lacking, but there are no warp points in Skyloft or anywhere in the sky for that matter, which becomes painfully noticeable because of how much you have to backtrack through the sky. While the flying in the first act isn't too bad, flying throughout the rest of the game becomes ridiculously bothersome. From here on out, you're only returning to places that you've already explored, which means there's far less anticipation of upcoming new gameplay experiences to alleviate the act of flying. Plus, the amount of flying necessary for progression grows exponentially as the game goes on. After the initial Isle of Songs sequence, you have to return to the Isle of Songs between every overworld visit instead of returning to Skyloft, but you'll also still want to return to Skyloft for new gear and side quests as well, so the amount of flying for progression quadruples in the second act, not to mention all the flying you'll be doing for side quests and goddess chests on the side. The first Isle of Songs visit at least had the platform rotating puzzle, but during the other two visits, there is literally nothing to do but watch an almost identical cutscene explaining that you have to return to yet another overworld area to play the harp again. The point of these visits is to learn a new song each time, but if you had to learn new songs, you could have learned them within the goddess statue in Skyloft, or the light tower could easily have been the Tower of Songs instead. The Isle of Songs is pointless. The only thing that it adds is an extra 45 minutes to the game's runtime between the lengthy sequence to unlock it and all of the flying back and forth and watching cutscenes here. And the flying only gets worse the longer the game goes on. The whole third act of the game involves flying all over the sky and doing weird filler content for hours. Each overworld visit is significantly shorter than previous ones, which means you're constantly flying throughout the entire third act. Not to mention, there are 2 different times that you're progressing through one of the regions, and you're suddenly forced to stop and fly all the way to a different region just to get a special quest item and fly all the way back to exactly where you were. Far too much of the progression in this game is just completely pointless backtracking to pad out the runtime. I honestly do love backtracking in games when it's done right. Backtracking can serve a very important purpose in both developing game mechanics and offering really effective storytelling and world building. One of my favorite game genres is the Metroidvania, which involves repeatedly backtracking through the game world. The experience is invigorating though, because you're constantly gaining new abilities that you can use to blast through enemies that used to give you a hard time, and that allow you to fully explore areas that you couldn't before. It creates this empowering feeling that you're really getting stronger and improving over time, and steadily unlocking more of the game world on your own merits. Even in other Zelda games, I love returning to previous areas later in the story. Ocarina of Time involves adventuring across Hyrule as a child during a time of peace, and then doing the same thing again as an adult after the world has been devastated by Ganondorf. Castletown is destroyed, the Kokiri Forest is overrun with monsters, Death Mountain is raining down fiery boulders, and Zora's Domain is completely frozen over. You get a real physical sense of what Ganondorf's takeover has done to Hyrule. It's essentially backtracking, but it's so effective because not only have you and your abilities changed, but the world itself has changed around you to tell a story. One of my favorite games of all time is Majora's Mask, which involves you constantly backtracking to areas and replaying story segments because you're stuck on an endless 3-day time loop. And I absolutely adore that experience because it creates an atmosphere of despair and inevitability through the gameplay to an almost incomparable level. Majora's Mask has arguably more backtracking than Skyward Sword, but it's a carefully crafted experience with a clear purpose in both the gameplay and the storytelling. Backtracking in Skyward Sword doesn't accomplish anything. You don't get a satisfying feeling of power escalation, since even though you do get more items and your sword gets stronger, the only way to beat most enemies is by solving the same exact motion puzzles over and over. You do get to explore new side locations within each area, but these locations are totally gated off behind one specific doorway, so it doesn't feel satisfying in the same way as accessing new parts of the same area with your new items and abilities. And nothing changes in the overworld by the second act as well, so there's no satisfying feeling of progression in the world or story over time. You're just walking and flying back and forth to the same exact areas again. There are changes in the third act, but they're just for the explicit purpose of one specific gameplay challenge, and then everything immediately reverts back to normal afterwards. If there's one thing that Skyward Sword's gameplay struggles with more than the progression though, it's in the quality of its gameplay variety. In the next part of this deep dive, I'll be talking about Skyward Sword's gameplay variety, going into detail with the Silent Realms and several other segments, as well as a general overview. There will be a playlist in the description that'll update once that part is completed. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you there!